I have to choose my words carefully here because of medical confidentiality issues. But yes, several of the witnesses who got up close and personal basically said that they had health issues, that they felt almost any technology that that involves, for example, exotic propulsion system, generation of high amounts of energy. Almost anything like that can be weaponized. First person to get this tech and figure it out and replicate it wins.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Watch Mojo and the Unveiled podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and today my guest is Nick Pope. He is one of the world's leading authorities on UFOs or UAPs. For 21 years, he was working for the UK Ministry of Defence, and from 1991 to 94, he was in charge of what they called the UFO desk, investigating UFOs. And since then, he has become a regular guest on TV series and documentaries that explore the phenomenon. So I welcome him today to shed some light on the topic with us and hopefully explore a little bit of the UAP disclosure news that's happening right now. Welcome, Nick. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on the show. Good to be here.
Excellent. Let's start by just looking a little bit at your history investigating UFOs for the UK Ministry of Defence. Take us back to that time in the early 90s. What was the landscape like surrounding UFOs? And were there any big standouts that still stick with you to this day from your time there?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that the subject was much more fringe then than it is now, particularly in the United States, where we've got, for example, now the Pentagon has a unit, Arrow, up studying this, and they have considerably more resources and personnel than we had. Part of that is obviously that the US is always the big dog in the room, but nonetheless, it's a fairly big sea change. But more fundamentally, I think the way in which we now have, for example, the US Congress fully engaged on this in both the Senate and the House. We have mainstream media engagement. And we didn't have that back in the early 90s, and particularly back in the UK. It was much more of a sort of fringe subject with the media and the public. And even in the Ministry of Defense, where we were doing it officially, of course, not just as a sort of private interest. I mean, this was sort of government business to do with looking at unidentified things in your airspace. But even with that said, it kind of languished in the backwaters a little. It was always difficult to get resources and capabilities put on this. Every time you wanted a meeting with senior people in the ministry and you had to say UFO, you would see people's eyes roll a little bit. And that's why we changed the language, of course, to UAP. That's another story. But it was a different era, absolutely. And yeah, most of our cases, just as most of the cases being looked at now in the Pentagon, of course, you find a conventional explanation, but some you don't, and some of those still stick with me 30 years plus on. Absolutely.
Yeah, I read on your website that about 5% of the cases that came across your desk actually remained unexplained. Of those cases, are there any that you can tell us about that you recall that really shocked or surprised you?
Sure. One series of sightings, collectively known as the Cosford incident, took place over a period of about 6 hours in March 1993. And this involved, I mean, multiple witnesses over, like I say, several hours, a lot of police and military witnesses. Two Air Force bases were directly overflown. A lot of people described a huge triangular shaped craft. One of the witnesses talked about a narrow beam of light being fired down at the ground and then tracking backwards and forwards as if it was looking for something. One witness described a low frequency humming sound, which he said was deeply unpleasant, actually. He said you could feel it as well as hear it, rather like if you, I guess, got too close to a speaker at a big rock concert or something like that, right in front of it. You know, you feel it reverberating through your body. So we had we had reports like that, and I launched a full investigation. The usual process. You try to eliminate all the sorts of things that historically people misidentify. So you speak to astronomers, meteorologists, Air Force experts, intelligence community personnel, radar folks. I mean, you just try and I guess find some sort of conventional object or phenomena that matches up both in terms of date, time, location, and then hopefully description. But we drew complete blank on this, and really, yeah, to this day, I mean, it just sits there almost like an unsolved crime in a police file. I often use that analogy, actually. An unsolved UFO case is like an unsolved crime. It doesn't technically ever get closed until you resolve it. But frankly, unless somebody comes along, digs it out, and does a cold case review, or unless some new witness comes forward, and either with a confession or with some new piece of evidence, it's just going to sit there as like an unsolved case.
That one of many cases that remain unsolved from your time investigating this?
Well, I mean, you quoted the statistic right. I mean, it's about 5% unexplained, and 200 or 300 cases a year. In some years, actually, that went closer to 700 or 800. But yeah, a sufficient, a small percentage, but enough, particularly given that the Ministry of Defence has been formally investigating since 1953, and even before that on an ad hoc basis. It's a small but statistically significant proportion of cases remain unexplained to this day.
Another big one that we often hear about is the Rendlesham Forest incident. That's actually one of the most popular and talked about UFO cases of all time, which just happens to have taken place in the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about that for those who aren't familiar with it?
Certainly. And yeah, I think you're right. It's probably second only to Roswell in terms of I guess name recognition and just the way that people in the UFO community would, I suppose, score a case in terms of credibility and things. I mean, multiple witnesses, military witnesses, 3 consecutive nights. This Rendlesham Forest lies between two United States Air Force bases in the UK, Bentwaters and Woodbridge. And the witnesses included the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, who saw it on the third night of activity. John Burroughs and Jim Penniston, two of the other witnesses most closely associated with this, saw it on the first night and actually saw it land. I mean, there's not a crash, an actual controlled landing. Something was on the ground for a few minutes, then took off again vertically and shot off at high speed. What's good about this case is that there's physical evidence in terms of the fact that this was tracked briefly on at least, I think, 3 different and independent radar systems. And the fact that because this thing landed, and they were able, of course, to go back to the landing site, there were indentations in the ground, burn marks, scorch marks on the sides of the trees. And very significantly, they took a Geiger counter out there. And of course, there's background radioactivity everywhere. I mean, a lot of that's just geological, but they found readings that if people want to read the declassified Ministry of Defense case file on this, will say that the defense intelligence staff, so government scientists, basically said that the levels of radiation found at the landing site seemed significantly higher than the average background. And that significantly higher than the average background is a direct quote from that declassified file.
So was there a case of an injury involved with this UFO sighting?
Yes, I have to choose my words carefully here because of medical confidentiality issues. But yes, several of the witnesses who got up close and personal. And remember, Jim Peniston, I say remember, but I don't think I said, but Jim Peniston on the first night got close enough that he actually touched the side of the hull of this thing, triangular shaped craft about 9 meters across and maybe nine feet tall. And yeah, some of the witnesses in later years basically said that they had health issues that they felt came from having gotten too close to this. And a lot of them, or some of them, approached the VA, and some of them, when they couldn't get what they felt was the proper hearing from the VA, they went actually to their senators. Senator John McCain was involved in this. Senator John Kyle was involved, probably some others, and basically said, "Look, help me." And every senator will have a you know a small staff of people, and they tend to specialize in various things because constituents tend to ask their congressional representatives about the same sort of three, four, five different issues more than anything: immigration issues, social security issues, VA issues, pension issues, those sorts of things. The same things come up. So there'll usually be a staffer who specializes with helping veterans and interfacing between constituents and the VA. And this particular, one of the staffers, Cheryl Bennett, very bright woman who worked for John McCain, hugely diligent, said she'd never come across the sorts of issues with the Rendlesham, the medical files on some of these witnesses. Never. And this is somebody who deals with these sorts of veteran issues almost every day. She said she'd never seen, first they denied some of these people were ever in the military. Then it was obviously proven, not least from their senior chain of command, who got very angry at that. Of course these people were there. They worked for me. The next step was, the medical records are classified. The next step was, well, we're just not paying out for anything UFO related. So then I got involved, and I remembered that there was a declassified British government intelligence assessment that literally had a line in saying that the Rendlesham Forest witnesses might have been exposed to what we called UAP radiation. So I got that into the system, and next thing, of course, a few of these cases were quietly settled, but with non-disclosure agreements tied to that. So because of that, and because of the medical confidentiality, I can't go into all the details, and I can't name names, but there's certainly some paperwork out there about it if people do want to do a deep dive, and it's an extraordinary aspect of this whole case for sure.
Right. And it's not uncommon to hear about injuries associated with UAPs. A recent one is a whistleblower, Jake Barber, who claims that he suffered similar sorts of radiation poisoning, I suppose, or injuries after having recovered UAP as a helicopter pilot. So there is a precedent for this. And I just wanted to touch upon the government transparency and secrecy aspect, because this is something that's been a struggle. As you mentioned, there's been congressional hearings, and there is resistance from certain parties within governments, particularly in the U.S., to reveal information. And it's pretty clear that they know more than they're revealing to the public. Do you think that's also the case in the United Kingdom and in other countries across the world?
Absolutely. It's part and parcel of government interaction with this. Part of it is because of the sorts of cases where there are physical harms. Absolutely. That is extremely sensitive. There would be an absolute outcry, I think, as indeed there should be, if the full extent of this got out. as well as Jake Barber, there's another case which actually even worse in a way because it involved civilians who just inadvertently encountered something. This is the Cash Landrum case from Texas in 1980, where again physical harms were caused. It's not incidentally clear that this is deliberate. Indeed, the consensus from those of us who've looked at this in government is that it's not deliberate. It may be an inadvertent byproduct of just getting too close to some sort of energy source and or propulsion system. But be that as it may, that's one of the reasons for secrecy. Tied to that, another big reason for government secrecy in the US, the UK, and elsewhere is the fact that almost any technology that that involves, for example, exotic propulsion system, generation of high amounts of energy, almost anything like that can be weaponized. So governments are very cautious about disclosing too much of what they're doing on UAP, what they know about UAP, anything that they may have recovered in particular, because an adversary might be able to take some of that information, particularly if they've got their own recovered hardware, whatever its source, and they may be able to weaponize it. So that's another reason. But we do know one of the interesting revelations that came up in the last couple of years was that when Sean Kirkpatrick was the director of Arrow, there was he was involved in what he called the UAP caucus or the UAP working group of the Five Eyes. Now, the Five Eyes is, of course, the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Alliance. So that on a range of subjects, not just UAP, could be Russia, China, whatever it is. And the Five Eyes Alliance is the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So we know, for example, that not just the US, but those other four nations were involved in this classified meeting at the Pentagon in May 2023, and presumably in subsequent meetings and staff work on this. But again, we don't hear any of this in the media and the public. It may be that in some of the classified briefings that Congress has been getting, that some of this has come out, but it doesn't even, of course, come out in the open public hearings.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about the story behind Arrow? It's come up in a few different conversations I've had with people, but we've never really dug into it. I know there was a lot of controversy because there's been different iterations of the office. But could you take us through like what the situation is with Arrow? First of all, the acronym, I always get it wrong. The All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Is that correct?
That's correct. So you got it
Okay,
right this time. But don't
excellent.
worry, all these terms are a real government, bureaucratic alphabet soup, and that's part of the intention. The point is that there's never really been a time when the US government hasn't been looking at this, whether it's back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, where we had US Air Force programs like Project Sign, Grudge, and Blue Book. Then, of course, there was now largely forgotten, but John Alexander's initiative where he had something, the Advanced Theoretical Physics Research Group, which was just a cover for looking at UAP. There was ORSAP and ATIP, its better known Pentagon iteration, all Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Then there was the UAP Task Force headed up by Jay Stratton. Then there was Arrow. Now, the point about Arrow is that it was congressionally mandated. So when in 2017 the New York Times broke the story of the existence of ATIP and the US Navy videos, a lot of people in Congress got pretty angry because, of course, even they had been given the same line as the media and the public. i.e., nobody's interested in this and nobody's doing it anymore. And so when the question came up, that's what congressional representatives told their constituents. Well, somebody had been looking at it. So so they got pretty annoyed and they said, well, we want to be told about this and we want some proper oversight. And so to get this on a proper regulatory footing, they said, well, the Pentagon needs to set up a unit to look at this because clearly it is a defense, national security, and safety of flight issue. And then we, Congress, need regular reports, both oral briefing sessions, but also formal written reports at least every year, but sometimes more than that. And so Arrow was basically set up because of congressional pressure to do so. And so Arrow works for all of us, the American people and our congressional representatives. But of course, there's always a bit of controversy because to a lot of people, Arrow are the bad guys. Arrow are the gatekeepers of the secret. I'm not sure that that's the case. Maybe it's the case that even Arrow haven't managed to actually get to these legacy intelligence community programs that some of the whistleblowers say exist. But be that as it may, that's who and what Arrow is. And of course, Sean Kirkpatrick's gone now, and there's a new management team in place. But some of the whistleblowers still don't trust Arrow, which is awkward in a sense, because what this means is that some of the whistleblowers are going to Arrow, and they've got a website where people can do that, aaro.mil. Any serving or former member of the government, the military, the intelligence community who claims to have knowledge and experience of one of these UAP programs can go to Arrow, and there are protections, whistleblower protections written into the law to do that. But be that as it may, some of the whistleblowers don't trust them, perhaps because of some of the things that were said by some of the people there, even after they left, in interviews, which made some of the whistleblowers think we're not going to get a fair hearing. These people, don't believe us. So some of the whistleblowers are going direct to Congress. And of course, that makes it a little bit confusing, particularly because it's not a single point of contact in Congress. The Senate's involved, the House is involved, the intelligence committees are involved, the armed services committees are involved, the oversight committees are involved. So lots of players. And now, sorry, I know this is a long answer.
No, no, I love it. Great information.
It gets even more complicated because now there's a new player. And that player, of course, is the newly formed task force on the declassification of federal secrets. They're going to be looking at it as well. Now, a lot of those people are also on the House Oversight Committee. But again, it does make it complex for the whistleblowers. It's like, well, wait, who are we supposed to go to here?
Right. And speaking of whistleblowers, the most recent one that I'm aware of, his name is Matthew Brown, who actually went to Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp to, deliver his message to the public. He is the original source for the Immaculate Constellation document that was brought forward by Michael Schellenberger last year, I believe. One kind of spooky quote that he said that ended their part three of their interview. I'd like to know what you make of this. He says, "You are not free, and this reality has far more to it than you have been allowed to believe, and God is real."
I saw that. It was, obviously the guy's very intelligent and articulate, but it was a clearly very, like, I don't want to say scripted because maybe it came out naturally, but it's, people like that have an effective way of communicating something that they know is going to resonate, and they know it's going to affect people in an almost visceral way, as this clearly did, judging from the social media reaction. I mean, yeah, and of course there are all sorts of things that you could read into it. The you are not free. I mean, it's a, I don't know. It hints at our alien overlords, but it also hints at maybe, I don't know, even things like simulation theory and the idea that reality and the observable universe is just a computer program. And this is not the first time that God and religiosity has been inserted into the narrative. I mean, you could say it's always been in the narrative. And of course, if you talk to ancient astronaut theorists, they'll say, well, extraterrestrials visited in our distant past, and our ancestors misperceived them as, and then worshipped them as gods. And then you hear people say things like the nine gods of Egypt and the ancient gods are returning. And there's a lot of that narrative. And then now, of course, we have a new pope, not me, the other one.
Right.
And of course, there were a flurry of stories about the Vatican secret archive and whether they knew something about all this. So there's a lot to digest there. Yeah, and I hope that all these people, and of course, nobody gets to testify to Congress without being properly vetted. So, but from everything we know so far, all these people, whether it's Lou Elizondo, David Grush, some of the more recent ones, they all do seem to be who they say they are and did what they said they did, but they're all going to have to, all these new ones, they're going to have to be vetted. Hopefully they'll get invited to Congress, both to testify at a classified level in a skiff, but also hopefully, open public hearings under oath, formally into the congressional record for everyone to view. So yeah, there's a lot going on right now, and more to come.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of interesting whistleblowers who have come out over the past few years. Lou Elizondo being chief among them, and I've spoken to him on this show as well. But I wanted to know your thoughts on a couple weeks ago there were these hearings in DC, and this is just going on about the point of how there is all this scrutiny and constant speculation and judgment about the information that is being shared because one photo that Lou Elizondo presented was debunked within hours of it going online as basically crop circles that a pilot took a photo of from an airplane. And to me, like I'm not making any judgment about whether there was an intention to present anything false or whatever, but it just seems that that alone did more harm than good. So it takes very small things to kind of like go a whole step back in the conversation when it comes to disclosure, which is a little bit discouraging to see. What's your take on all of that?
Yeah, look, anyone can make a misstep, and I think Lou would be the first to say that he's made some. Who hasn't? And one time a national newspaper sent me a low resolution photo of a UFO that had been sent into them, and I looked at it and I said, "Wow, this is really, really interesting." They ran a story. Later on, I saw a high resolution picture, and it was clearly a seagull. Somebody had taken flying at high speed with a back in the day, a slightly slower shutter speed so that it had blurred, and it was perfectly obvious once I saw the high resolution copy. Was that a misstep because I said, well, I want to hold off and until I see a high res copy. I didn't even know there was one out there. So yeah, look, anyone can make a misstep, and that's one thing. And I've seen, look, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Talking of Lou, just this week, I see that somebody's criticized him because he was invited to testify in a skiff, and he was speaking at a UFO conference. Well, I happen to know that they changed the date of the briefing, and I think my understanding is that he'd cleared his diary so that he could do that. And then Congress at the last moment said, "Oh, we can't do that. We've moved the hearing or moved the briefing." And then Lou looked at his diary. And this is my understanding. And of course, Lou had agreed. Conference organizers ask 6 to 12 months ago in advance if you can attend. Lou had said yes. And then Congress said, oh, by the way, we've changed the date. Lou had committed. So what's he supposed to do? Is he supposed to? There were hundreds of people there. It's a family festival, lots of kids. He was one of the, if not the star attraction there. What's he supposed to do? Pull out and say, I'm going to disappoint all those hundreds of people who've bought tickets? I guarantee if he had done that, the other half of the internet would be criticizing him for that. So he said, no, look, Congress rescheduled, they can reschedule again. And if we all sit down with the diaries, we will find a date. So he's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't with something like that. I've got no brief to defend Lou on this, but I can see when someone's being caught between a rock and a hard place, and that's absolutely what's happened to him this week. And once you explain the situation, it's easy, but let's not kid ourselves. There are some people out there who are just trying to make trouble for him.
Well, I think the comment that I made was more to the effect that the public seems like there's just like a lot of arguing when it comes to UAP disclosure and the UAP topic in general. And but a lot of people don't disagree with each other, and I think that makes it hard to move the conversation forward because there's so much disagreement. What do you think needs to be done in order to get more people on the same page to have more constructive conversations about it?
Do more things face to face. That's why the pandemic and the whole rise of doing things via Zoom and all these other platforms, it might have solved a short-term problem, but it's created a long-term problem too. And look at the way people scream at each other on social media, yet sit them down in the same room. And very often that defuses. UAP hearings are a case in point. Look at how bipartisan they are. Look at the fact that for every senior Democrat you've got involved, like Chuck Schumer or Kirsten Gillibrand, you've got a senior Republican like Marco Rubio. And when did you ever see, as you see, for example, with these UAP hearings, Tim Burchett sitting down with AOC? I mean, so that's the answer. It's let's get back to doing more things face to face. And I think if that is done, skeptics, diehard debunkers, and true believers, who are at I guess, the opposite ends of the same spectrum, the belief spectrum, maybe wouldn't scream and shout at each other and hate on each other so much.
I'm also interested in how the dynamics work between countries when it comes to UAPs. Is there a significant difference to your knowledge in the way that the UK handles it versus the way the United States handles it? Is there a sort of coordinated secrecy effort between countries, or is it all just dependent on individual nations? Like, what's that dynamic like?
There is much less international cooperation and collaboration than one would think or maybe hope for. Sometimes people say that the United Nations should take a lead on this. I actually discussed this face to face with a former head of the UN Outer Space or Office for Outer Space Affairs, and she was very clear the UN doesn't want this. There is certainly in the West the intelligence sharing that I mentioned earlier in our talk through the mechanism of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance. So there is some very limited cooperation on UAP between the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But aside from that, that's about it. China has its own program, of course, but because of the closed nature of that society and the fact that it's an adversarial relationship, we don't know much about what China are doing. Russia has a program, same story, of course. We don't have much access. Maybe the intelligence community have managed to use their resources to find out a few things about what China and Russia knows. But generally speaking, it's everyone's doing their own thing, even with allies. The French, for example, they've got a program. but they embed it not in the DoD or the Air Force or the intelligence community, but in their National Space Center. So lots of different countries, lots of different UAP programs, lots of different ways of doing things.
Do you agree with the sentiment that disclosure, well, capital D disclosure will never happen from governments, that it will be due to whistleblowers and the public sharing information to get that out there and become accepted by most people?
Well, two possible answers to that question. One is that the phenomenon itself probably gets the casting vote on this. And so disclosure may not come from us, but from them or it, whatever it may be. But I think the other thing about government is that it depends which government. And of course, we hear recently the phrase controlled disclosure, the idea that there's a sort of plan to acclimatize us and drip feed it and then, I don't know, disclose it in 2027 or whenever. But catastrophic disclosure is the idea that it might suddenly all come out at once, perhaps from a whistleblower, but perhaps from an adversary who would then seek to leverage that for geopolitical advantage. I'll make one other point on that. From my own experience of government, if the United States government, for example, felt or knew through intelligence that another country was suddenly going to do it, or a whistleblower that they couldn't stop was going to do it, then they probably would have a quick 24-hour flash to bang plan to put it out there, just because governments always like to get ahead of the narrative and have narrative control rather than let somebody else do it.
Is there really an arms race, as people have said, for UAP technology between nations that are competing?
Yes, first person to get this tech and figure it out and replicate it wins. I mean, imagine if these stories are true and there really is extraterrestrial or NHI, whatever term you want to use, technology. That could be a technology a billion years ahead of us. Well, maybe the best thing, and I mean this, is that we don't figure it out if it can be weaponized. But if we can figure it out, absolutely, the nation that wins that race is going to be the dominant force on this planet for the foreseeable future, because suddenly they get this technology that, as Arthur C. Clarke would have said, would be indistinguishable from magic.
How do you think the disclosure process should go with that in mind, that there's a lot at stake here?
One word answer: carefully. Because for all the people that say, yeah, we can handle the truth, just put it out there. Number one, as I've said, a lot of this tech might be something that could be weaponized. But number two, as I've said in a few recent interviews, what if there's a dark side to this? If disclosure was easy, we'd have done it by now, right? Particularly if this has been going on for 80 years. So if it ain't easy, it's hard. And that does suggest that there's something about this that maybe is entangled with some secret too terrible to be told. So my one word answer: how should we proceed with disclosure? Carefully. My two-word answer: very carefully.
It seems to me that a lot of people perceive the motive for the secrecy to be, greed and power, basically. But it sounds like from what you're saying that may be more to that. What do you think the real reason is for having keeping this secret for so long?
That's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah, greed and power may well be part of the equation, but I do think the good in us means that the other side of the equation is caution. That we don't, I mean, I don't want to oversimplify or over dramatize it, but look, if there is some technology that could give us almost unlimited, uh, powerful renewable, clean energy, who's to say that that same technology couldn't create a bomb that would split the planet wide open if it was even not even deliberately, but just inadvertently? How many times, does I mean, imagine a box of matches in the hands of a child. And so yeah, greed and power may be part of it, but a justifiable caution that actually there might be things here dangerous to us is, I think, another part of the answer.
So there's little doubt that UAPs exist and that there are things in the sky doing stuff that we hadn't known to be physically possible. A lot of people or whistleblowers have made claims that there is non-human intelligence behind these UAPs. What is your opinion on that? What do you think about the whole NHI discussion, and has it changed and evolved over time?
It has, yes. And I think NHI is quite a helpful term because, of course, the extraterrestrial hypothesis is only one of a number of competing theories about what we're dealing with here. Is it aliens? Is it time travelers from the future? Is it the sort of crypto or ultra terrestrial idea that we might share this planet with other intelligences? Is it the idea of something from other dimensions? Or is it something that we have neither the words nor the concept for? And of course, the point with all of this is it's not mutually exclusive. You could have, just because there are aliens doesn't mean there can't be time travelers, to put it simply.
Right. Um, so that said, we're witnessing these things. Do you have any indication, and there's many theories about this too, but what is your take on what the intention may be? Because we've been seeing them a lot. They've done certain things, interactions with nuclear sites and facilities, but no or very few outright hostile actions towards humans. What is your interpretation of what the intent might be?
Well, there's a declassified Ministry of Defense document that articulates this, and it says, and I'm paraphrasing, but something like, in the absence of overt hostile force, there are three possibilities. One, military reconnaissance. Two, scientific study. Three, and this always gets a laugh, tourism. But you know, I would add a fourth, and maybe it's somewhere between. It's a subset of the third, but I think anthropology would be a
Mhm.
explanation, because let's face it, to civilizations a billion years ahead of us, we're not going to have anything to teach them about, science and technology, but they might be interested in the more individual things, our political systems, our religious beliefs, art, literature, poetry, music, architecture, those sorts of things. So that's that would be my answer. Anthropology.
Yeah, I would imagine that Earth is one heck of a good reality TV show for
The idea, yeah, reality TV show, science experiment, prison planet, insane asylum, all those theories. We kind of laugh at them, but all those theories are out there.
So there's another element that's also kind of taken some of the spotlight, which is about this kind of psi phenomenon that's been spoken about in relation to the military using psionic assets to attract UAPs and interact with them. Um, there's been a lot of talk about remote viewing, and I've interviewed some people who have been involved in remote viewing. All of many of those programs are declassified and admitted that there were remote viewing programs in operation for decades and decades. How do you think that plays into it? What's your interpretation of the discussion about psi phenomena that's been recently connected with UAPs?
It's interesting for sure, and it's kind of, I relate that question to your earlier question about the religiosity that's being inserted into the conversation, because I think what with the psionics and the religiosity, we're seeing the conversation become a little bit more complex and nuanced rather than just the very binary, hey, are we being visited by aliens or not? And it's interesting, like you say, there's no denying the fact that the US government had a number of remote viewing programs. And interestingly, the mindset with that wasn't necessarily a corporate belief in this, but it was a sort of, look, why not? It's much cheaper than designing and launching a new reconnaissance satellite. What have we got to lose from trying? And why don't we try as many things as possible? So when we're gathering intelligence from the Russians, yeah, let's use satellites, let's use reconnaissance aircraft, let's use spies, let's try remote viewing. Why not? And I think it's the same with UAP. Yeah, let's insert this whole question of psionics into the debate. And after all, if you have remote viewing, if that does work, as many of the people who've been involved in these programs say it does, then the flip side of that is remote influencing. And then that's really not that different from the idea of psionics as it's being discussed in relation to UAP. Maybe we can somehow attract these things. There's an old saying, in neuro-linguistic programming, if what you're doing isn't working, try something else. And I think it's people don't realize how widely that mindset is tried in government, as it should be. It's common sense, really.
Do you think that any governments have had direct contact with ETs?
I don't know. I haven't seen a smoking gun myself. I don't rule it out.
It's interesting because I mean, I think that you're a bit of a sci-fi buff. If I've read that on your website. It's been such a popular genre of entertainment for us, probably one of the most popular. And I wonder if that's a coincidence or if there's something that we're innately drawn to with regards to space and the universe and other beings, possibly being here. But then on the flip side of it, Hollywood controls so much of the representation that we witness. And do you think that that is an intentional influence? How do you think people's views have been shaped by the movies and the media that they see about aliens and about space?
I don't think Hollywood's part of a conspiracy. I've heard it suggested that Hollywood is part of an acclimatization program. But I think if that was true, the narrative would be pushing almost universally in one direction. And it isn't. Because for every movie like Independence Day or War of the Worlds with the alien threat, you've got the flip side and the friendly aliens like E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So I think with Hollywood, it really is just Hollywood doing Hollywood and entertaining people. And fear sells. So yeah, absolutely. Some of those movies will be, you know, the alien threat. But on the other hand, who doesn't love ET? So and so the narrative is going both ways, which you wouldn't have if this was a psyop. And I think there are some. I think my two favorite alien movies, by the way, are Contact and Arrival, because to paraphrase one of the sci-fi authors who commentated on this, he said something to the effect of all good science fiction isn't really just about aliens. It's ultimately it's about us. And and I think, but going back to your question, I think people love a mystery. People love the unknown, and humanity since the dawn of time has looked up at the stars, looked up into the skies and wondered. So it's kind of hardwired into us.
Yeah, I agree. I actually watched Arrival just last week with my wife. I love that movie. And it kind of got me thinking, like, maybe that's kind of a representation or an exaggerated representation of what's actually happening in the world because there are a lot of sightings. Like, there is a lot of evidence of UAPs out there, but maybe they're waiting for us to figure something out before taking any sort of action. Do you think that that could be a possibility?
Yes, I once went to a Royal Society discussion meeting about the detection of extraterrestrial life and the consequences for science and society. And somebody asked, how do we get their attention? And somebody's answer was, we should do something interesting.
Yeah, maybe instead of fighting each other, we should, do something else that might be a little bit more enticing for them.
Well, Stanton Friedman once said that to any advanced extraterrestrial civilizations looking at us, planet Earth, he said they would see a primitive society whose primary activity is tribal warfare. And I think, yeah, we have to go beyond that and do something interesting.
There's a lot of people, trying to do good scientific inquiry into this phenomenon. And I bring it back to Jake Barber with his Skywatcher team, who's are trying to measure and observe and categorize UAP. But with the level of secrecy, I know I've spoken about it a lot, the secrecy aspect, but it's fundamental. How can science make any advancements without there being more availability of information?
It can't because science, needs access to the data. Now, I think you've had Avi Loeb on the show before, and one of
Yes.
Avi's best known quotes is, of course, you can't classify the skies. And I think that's why the work that Avi Loeb and Galileo Project is doing is so important because he's not inventing or depending on any sort of spooky unknown physics. He's saying we just use the standard model, the standard scientific process and method. We make a hypothesis, design an experiment to test it, run the experiment, analyze the data, and see if it's repeatable and non-falsifiable. And um, you have to use the scientific method, and yeah, if half of the data are closed off to you because of classification, it's like trying to run a race with one hand tied behind your back or something like that. I mean, you can't do it. So the challenge, obviously, Avi Loeb's doing great work. The challenge is going to be to get more more Avi Loebs, and I think obviously he's a thought leader in this, but his work will be done when the rest of the scientific establishment catches up with him. And so, yeah, we need more scientists involved. But one of the problems is that you then ask, well, what scientists? Is it astrophysicists? Is it astronomers? Is it because the proper study of UAP is going to be multidisciplinary. And that was evidenced by those Royal Society discussion meetings that I mentioned a few moments ago. Those were multidisciplinary. For every cosmologist and astrophysicist that was there was a psychologist, an anthropologist, and even a theologian. So we need to have a multidisciplinary conversation about this. But yeah, if we're ever going to prove this to the satisfaction of everyone, we need more scientific engagement and we need something that adheres to the scientific method.
Right. And another obstacle has been stigma in the scientific community. And you mentioned the change from the terminology UFO to UAP in an effort to kind of shed some of that stigma that's been around for decades and decades. Do you think that the the sentiment is shifting among the scientific community, seeing that this is being taken seriously by Congress and governments, that there is legitimate scientific inquiry from people like Avi Loeb? Is the snowball starting to build?
It is, and all these people are herd animals. So once they see the herd begin to shift direction, the rest of the herd will swing around, and that is happening. The stigma has reduced. It's still there. There's still, I think, massive underreporting from the pilot community, whether it's military or civilian. And there are still not nearly as many scientists involved in this as there should be. But once the peer-reviewed papers are published, as they are beginning to be, for example, with Galileo project, then I think things will shift. But it's a process rather than a single event, and sometimes it can be frustratingly slow.
I'd like to leave you with an interesting question. If tomorrow, this is hypothetical, if tomorrow you were placed in charge of the United States UAP disclosure efforts, what would be your first actions that you would take?
My first action would be to identify all the key stakeholders, um, and other people with direct verifiable knowledge of this, and just get them in a room together. Going back to my earlier answer about face-to-face contact, make sure that it was in a skiff and that everyone was cleared to disclose what they knew, and then just talk and listen and brainstorm and find out where we are. Because because too often people just shout at each other across the divide, and somebody says X and then somebody else says Y. Get them in a room together, sit them down in a friendly, bipartisan, non-controversial, non-confrontational way, and just see what we've got. And then we can take it from there.
Oh, I wish somebody like you was in charge because I think things would actually move.
Well, who knows? Never say never.
Nick Pope, it's been great speaking with you. Is there anything that you'd like to share with the audience in terms of places to go to find your work or anything that you've done?
Well, people can look at my website, which is nickpope.net, and the social media platform that I use most frequently and notify people of upcoming events and things that have caught my eye is X, formerly known as Twitter, where my handle is at Nick Pope MOD.
Excellent. Well, I encourage everybody to check out your stuff. You have a great website with a lot of information on it, and I really enjoyed looking at it. So I hope that everybody else will check out some of your work. And thank you so much for your time. I hope we can speak again soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed this conversation. Took us to a lot of interesting places, I think,
Definitely, and then lots more to come. I think the conversation's going to continue to be very interesting as the year unfolds.
for sure.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care, and I'll see you next time.